Good evening and welcome to this episode of Biz1st in Focus on TV1. I'm your host tonight, Shaheen Jarangpati. Well, as kids, our parents constantly advised us to be safe and keep away from strangers. And given the current context in the country, financial fraud appears to be a headline-making story on a daily basis. But what we do not talk about is something alienating society: food fraud and food security. What is food fraud and food security? Well, to talk about these matters, we are joined by Nick Henson, an expert on food security and food fraud. Well, he's no stranger to this sector because he's been in the field for 35 years. Mr. Henson, welcome to the show.
Good evening, Shaheen.
Mr. Henson, let's start simple. What is food security and what is food fraud?
Okay, so food security would be ensuring that the food that you purchase is what it claims to be, that it's safe, there's no bacteria like salmonella to make you sick, there's no nuts and allergens to make you sick also, and it's legal, it meets the requirements, no pesticides, so it's good, fit, healthy food that's safe for your family.
Well, I suppose when people talk about food security, they get the picture. But what is quite astonishing is the term food fraud. I mean, there's fraud everywhere you look.
Yes.
Now it's come to the point where even there's fraud even in food. So how could you describe this?
Okay, so food fraud is not new. It's been around for perhaps 15,000 years. So when man began to drink milk from animals, he thought, I have some milk, I have 1 litre. If I add some water, I'll have 2 litres. So from the very beginning, when man began to eat foods, he's been adding things to them to make more money. So fraud is adding things to a food to make more money from it, or perhaps to sell you a cheaper thing rather than the better thing. So maybe I'll sell you some old burnt oil rather than extra virgin olive oil. So one is cheap, one's expensive. If you can't tell the difference, I make more money, and that's the fraud.
In today's context of the global food chain, where do you see food fraud most prevalent in the world?
Everywhere, literally everywhere. So the changes are that once upon a time, our food was grown literally locally. And so we would eat the food from our own gardens, our own animals, from our neighbours' animals. That's not true anymore. Our food now travels perhaps 20, 30,000 kilometres to our tables. So there are many, many, many more chances to alter it, to change it, to add things, remove things, to play with it. So the change is the way our food travels around the world, and that affects all of us. We all eat things now from all over the world.
Now, where does this whole process of food fraud begin? Which part of the production process does it start from?
At any part. So imagine that I am a manufacturer and I have a competitor. My competitor is adding a substance to his food illegally. His food is now cheaper than my food. I have a choice. Do I say nothing and go bankrupt, or do the same? So now I'm being forced to choose as a manufacturer. Do I carry on being ethical and honest and making good, safe food, or do I choose to follow his lead and become corrupt and illegal and add things? So in manufacturing, people are under immense pressure to add things to their food because others are. So that's one case. But imagine that I resist temptation, I make safe food, good food, legal food, and sell that to somebody else. So at every step, from manufacturing through to producing, blending, selling, all the way to the shop, at each time there is the chance to add something, remove something, alter something. It's the entire supply chain from growing and rearing to your table. Every step is at risk.
Mr. Henson, obviously there are guidelines a particular manufacturer is supposed to follow in terms of ensuring food security. So how does food fraud occur despite these guidelines? Is it a lack of strictness followed by these authorities?
Not at all. So all authorities are being very diligent, very careful. They are testing food, but you can't do all of it. So if I import literally millions of tons of food, perhaps I'll sample 1%, and I will choose the 1% which is most at risk.
On an annual basis, how much of a loss does food fraud cause to, let's say, to the globe? Now, how does it affect humanity?
Literally, nobody knows. But in terms of the worst case, it kills. So in China, a case there with milk where they added a plastic to the milk, and this killed 6 babies and made about 300,000 sick. And in Spain, there was oil that was meant to be used in manufacturing for plastics and chemicals, was added to food and killed 300 people. That's one extreme, but the other extreme, yourself and myself. I buy some prawns from the shop which are frozen, and they're glazed with ice to protect them, so I thaw them out, and suddenly I have half water and half prawns. And I realise the manufacturer has added more water and more ice than he claims to have done. So for always everything from killing you and being harmful all the way through to a few rupees of extra water in your prawns with the ice.
Well, we don't have to look at Spain and China, as you said, because recent reports on social media perhaps suggested certain rice imported to Sri Lanka which claims to have been plastic.
Absolutely.
So where do we draw the line here? How do we ascertain the cause of this?
Okay, so this case came out where on social media people claimed to have balls of rice, basmati rice, which were bouncing around the room, and then this was claimed to be plastic. This wasn't the case. So if you imagine plastic costs this much in rupees, rice costs this much, there's no benefit. And the machine to turn plastic to rice costs millions of rupees. Therefore, there is no commercial benefit to turn plastic into rice. This was not true. The important thing is, after the report, basmati imports into your country dropped, and also your own domestic rice increased from 80 rupees to 110 rupees. And why? Because the consumer believed that the basmati rice was harmful. It wasn't. It was really a scare story on the internet. But you see the impact is reduced imports from India and Thailand and increased sales of your own products. So people believed the stories and they switched from basmati to local rice. So true or not, there was an impact commercially, financially and politically.
Now, such reports causes concerns among the general public for obvious reasons, right? So then what happens through this? The general public resort to other measures like ready-made food or junk food. How does this impact society?
Okay, so it's the reverse. If I purchase food which is obviously the animal, the fish or the vegetable or the spice that I believe it is, the chances to alter it, to change it, to add things, to remove things is far less. If I buy a heavily processed food where I can't tell the animal, the vegetable, the fish or the plant or the spice, things can be added and changed. So let's take an extreme example in China. People have made eggs. So literally they have taken chemicals and they have made actual chicken's eggs out of chemicals and sold them as eggs. That's a complete extreme. At the further extreme, in your own home, you are making food and you're frying your food in the evening and the oil in your frying pan smells different. If your smell changes from week to week, the chances are the oil you are buying, the blend changes week to week. So the manufacturer of the oil is changing the oil composition and the blend. He's adding cheaper ones, different ones. It's altering. But if you buy a better, higher class of oil, it should be the same oil all the time, the same smell, the same flavour, the same benefits. And with meat and fish, I place them in the pan, I cook them, and suddenly they shrink. And why is that? Because someone has put water into them, and that water will come out when you cook it, and then you find you have bought a poorer quality product. So this is not about people dying from milk in China or oil in Spain. They were completely extreme examples. This is about small-scale fraud. And why? The criminals don't want to be caught. So they will do small things. They will add sugar to your fruit juice. They will add water to your milk and water to your chicken breast. And that way, that will carry on for weeks and months and years, and they will make millions of rupees. They don't want to be famous. If they kill somebody, people will investigate, and then they're famous. So the entire intent is they want to stay under the police notice, making food that is not legal, but not dangerous either.
Well, Mr. Henson, we have to cross over a short commercial break. You're watching Biz1st in Focus. We are talking about food security and food fraud. See you on the other side. Welcome back to the program. You're watching Biz1st in Focus, and we are joined by Nick Henson, an expert on food security, and we're talking about food security and food fraud. Mr. Henson, can you give us some examples of major food fraud detections in the world and what measures have been taken once they were detected?
Absolutely. But this is actually an arms race. It's like a warfare. Each time the criminals find a way to evade the law, the government will find a test and the criminals go around it. So repeatedly the government finds a new test, they implement the controls and monitoring, and the criminals will find a way to avoid that. So if we take the horse meat scandal in the UK, this scandal really was not a major scandal. Frankly, it was ethical rather than food safety. This was just eating horse rather than cow. And so what, you might ask? And frankly, yeah, so what? It was the main concern was that if they had given veterinary chemicals and drugs to the horses that weren't fit for people to eat, that was the concern. It was not that you can't eat horse meat, you can and you should. It's that the chemicals that the horses were given, if they were sick, could make you sick. The worst case, again, was in China, and this is where the milk given to babies was changed, and so a chemical was added that was toxic, and it was added purely to increase the value of the milk. This caused about 6 deaths of babies, but also 300,000 were made ill. So what was the outcome? The result is that in China, mothers will buy their milk on the internet. They now don't trust the manufacturers of milk in China, and they are buying their milk on the internet.
Speaking of buying food on the internet,
yes,
several apps are out now where you can actually purchase food and get them delivered. I mean, these are basic groceries where you can get them delivered to your house.
Sure.
So now, given that what you just said, does this not cause a concern given this convenient method of purchasing food?
Not for me. If you buy from a reputable website, and of course there are both, if I go online and I find a strange food supplement which claims to be healthy or beneficial but not proven, I'd be alarmed. If I see things that are endorsed by sports people or by politicians or by media people, I'm concerned.
Now, Mr. Henson, you are a food expert, so you know this. The general public, someone like me, I wouldn't know this. So how do we create awareness among the general public on this matter, especially given like technology is becoming quite advanced, and it should, for the convenience of all of us. So how do we create awareness and tell people be safe of this?
Okay, so good, proper, healthy food doesn't require to be advertised. So meat and vegetables and fish don't need advertising. The things that are advertised are highly processed. These have been modified, have chemicals added to them. So if I were to shop for my family, I would shop locally. I would buy from the fishmonger. I would buy from a good supermarket. I would buy less but better meat and fish. And I would buy my meat and fish as whole meat and whole fish. If you buy minced, if you buy processed, you can't tell. So the risk is if you buy things where you cannot see what's been added.
Mr. Henson, there are concerns over processed meat. So as a food expert, would you recommend a parent to give processed meat to their child?
I would say we're all busy, we all have limited money, and so it's a balance. And so where possible, you would buy a piece of meat for the family. But yes, I buy for my children minced meat because I accept it's convenient. There are some meals where it's very useful. So it's a balance. It's about not just eating all processed foods, but buying some things locally. It's about going to a shop that you trust. It's about knowing what's at risk. So in terms of what's at risk, things such as spices. So saffron, is it saffron? Maybe not. It could be meat fibres or cotton fibres dipped in dye. So your main defence is your nose and your mouth. Because if the food that you eat doesn't look right, or taste right, or smell right, the chances are it isn't right.
Mr. Henson, in Sri Lanka as well, if you see a couple of fruit stalls, most fruits look amazing, sometimes too good to be real. Some people know that there is a particular scam behind this. What do you think?
You're completely right. If the price is wrong, the food is wrong. So know the value of the food. If you know the price of a kilo of rice, or of a piece of meat, or a pint of milk, a litre of milk, if you know those prices, if the price is less, then why is it less? Plainly, let's take a thing like pomegranate juice. So pomegranate juice, perhaps 2 to 3 years ago, suddenly this was a wonder food. Everyone wanted to drink pomegranate juice. It was healthy, it had certain benefits for your health. They weren't proven, but they were claimed. So sales increased by threefold. So 3 times as much was drunk as the previous year. But the quantity of fruit grown didn't increase. So that tells us that 2/3 of all the juice drunk, pomegranate juice, could not be pomegranate. It had to be other juices and water and colourings. So if a thing is fashionable, if a thing is hard to find, it's worth changing. And that's where people target.
Mr. Henson, we have to cross over for another short commercial break. You're watching Biz1st in Focus. I'm Shahin Jarampati, and we're joined by Nick Henson, an expert on food security. We're talking about food security and food fraud. Welcome back to Biz1st in Focus. We are in discussion with Nick Henson, an expert on food security. We're talking about food security and food fraud. Mr. Henson, we were talking about serious concerns about food security and food fraud before we crossed over for the commercial break. As the general public grows more and more aware of food security, this causes concern among the domestic farmers because what they produce goes under high inspection. So how do we bring this under one roof and streamline this process?
That's difficult because in every country in the world there are many bodies involved in regulation. There are consumer concerns, there are political concerns. In Europe there is one shared set of rules, and so under what's called Codex Alimentarius, each country applies the same levels for pesticides, the same levels for chemicals, so each country can move their food between borders with no problems. But Sri Lanka doesn't currently have the same set of rules in place. So there are 2 risks. One is that the farmer potentially believes he is growing the food for the local market when no one will check the pesticide levels. Or even worse, other countries may think, I can send my food to Sri Lanka with high pesticide levels because they won't check either. So what's required is not to adopt European limits, but certainly to have your own clear limits that are applied to all foodstuffs.
Mr. Henson, for example, financial fraud, all these kinds of frauds we find in the country today, affects a particular group of people. How does food fraud affect people?
It affects everybody, all of us. And strangely, both those that are rich and that are poor. So if we take wine, for example, so we may laugh that a man spends $1,000 on a bottle of wine, and then we think, if that wine isn't what he thinks it is, it's karma, he deserves it. But currently in Europe, if I buy a bottle of wine, right or wrong, for $1,000 and drink the wine, the bottle is still valuable. People will steal that bottle, empty, and fill that bottle with some crap wine. And so all of a sudden, they will sell that bottle once more with the poor quality of wine inside and pretend it was the good wine. So that may be karma, but at the other extreme, people in India make milk that is not milk. This is from shampoo, from urea, from chemicals. They will take a blend of chemicals and make a white milky powder and sell that as milk. And this is harmful. There is no food value, and it's harmful also. So this affects the poorest and the richest.
So now there are standards that are supposed to be followed in terms of food manufacturing, like ISO and HACCP. So how do you assess food quality and safety measures using these standards?
Okay, so in the past I have purchased food from all over the world, from Sri Lanka too, and I look for these food standards. So HACCP is essential, but there are now also international food safety standards adopted by many manufacturing sites and in Sri Lanka too. So I am looking at the list of suppliers to find those who have embraced world standards, because they are equal and equivalent to anyone in the world.
How has food security and food fraud affected Sri Lanka in particular?
For me, not at all, because the manufacturers who have chosen to embrace world standards are recognised as world standard manufacturers, and they are able to offer their products onto the world market.
Mr. Henson, in terms of food security, climate change is something that creates a huge impact in the agriculture sector. So what measures do governments and institutes have to resort to ensure that food security is at a high standard?
Okay, so we use a thing called horizon scanning. So horizon scanning is literally that, it is looking over the horizon to try to predict what is the next scandal, the next opportunity for the thieves. So, for example, in India, if a cumin harvest is smaller than the previous year, then that is the opportunity to add things to the cumin to go further. But this could be ground up peanut shells or ground up almond shells, and this has happened. So if the crop is reduced, people will try to find other things to add. Why is that a risk? Because if peanuts and almonds still have some nut protein and peanut protein, that could kill somebody. And so in America, there have been 8 people made very ill by eating food that contained cumin that contained peanut and almond shells.
Mr. Henson, in Sri Lanka, in areas where farming is their livelihood, the current drought has severely affected their trade. So what can they do as a backup plan? Because clearly the harvesting seasons have changed now because of the drought, because of inconsistent rain. So how do they resort to other measures?
That's the risk, is that as the weather becomes less consistent, people turn to more processed foods because the quality can deteriorate. So year to year, the yield and the quality and the appearance becomes less consistent, and so people look to heavily processed foods because these are more visually appealing.
Do you think, given at that instance, importing is the right move?
That depends, because I understand that for fish, you have a massive resource of fish locally, and yet I believe you import a large proportion of your own fish. That's a problem, because fish is one of the most fraud-affected species. You're never quite sure what you're buying. You think you're buying one variety of fish, but you can't tell, because each fish is so similar. You can end up buying a fish that is protected, which is going extinct, but you believe you're buying one which has been fished or farmed legally. You can't tell.
Mr. Henson, in a note I have, you, as a matter of fact, have listed types of food which are at risk of fraud, and you've listed out tea, spices, black pepper, fruit juice, milk, meat, fish, oil. Tell me how food fraud happens in terms of tea, because tea is quite a vibrant industry in Sri Lanka.
Absolutely. Okay, so you might imagine that tea is tea. No, because tea, of course, as you know, there are many qualities and many varieties, but in many cases it's not just that they will put the rubbish from the floor in the tea, they will also add things that aren't tea. So you will find that they are mixing other plants in with the tea.
So how do the food experts try to identify which foods and what kind of foods are at risk of fraud, and how do they detect this?
Okay, so the foods that are at risk are those where you can add things without being detected. So anything such as honey, for example. So honey can be very valuable. It can be anything from $2 a jar up to $80 a jar for some rare honeys, but you can't tell them apart readily. So there is a great deal of effort going into trying to have a test in place to differentiate between honey grown in New Zealand or in Australia or in America. But really the foods to focus on are those like milk and fruit juice and meat and fish, staples, the important things, rather than honey and things that are more exotic. It's the basics: oil, fish, meat, vegetables.
Mr. Hansen, in the event of a food shortage, most governments rely on importing food. But this has a massive risk. For example, not too long ago in Sri Lanka, a container full of cocaine arrived mixed with sugar. So even though the smugglers are aware of these containers, there is a high possibility it could get distributed to the consumer. So then there again, how do we create awareness among the people, and how to be safe from these issues?
Yeah, it's true. And in 2014, I believe, there was 187,000 tons of brown sugar from Brazil was to be imported into Sri Lanka, and in that sugar was sand. But luckily, it was found by the authorities and rejected. So this sugar was never on your market. It was found by testing, and that shows a good example of testing on the import authorities to prevent those foods being sold in your market.
Mr. Hansen, we got just a few minutes more. So just to wrap up, what advice and what message could you give to our viewers watching right now?
Certainly. I would buy local. Where I can, I would buy food grown where I live. And I would choose a shop that I trusted and stick with it. If you buy cheap food from a pound store or a dollar store, then the chances are that food is not as safe as from a good supermarket. I would buy less and better quality food. I would try to buy food that was visibly what it was. So I would buy fish that is fish, meat that is meat, and that way the chances for someone to have made them into something else is far reduced. So it's about buying locally, about buying good quality, it's about buying unprocessed foods, and beware the price. If the price looks wrong, the food is wrong.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Nick Henson, for being with us on the show. That was Nick Henson, expert on food security. Well, he knows what he's talking about because he's been in the industry for 35 years. And here's a simple message. Well, it's a message every one of our parents give us. Watch what you eat. Well, if you have to spend more money, spend it on food. You've been watching Biz1st in Focus. I'm Shahin Jirampati. Good night.